And so to kick things off, I'd like to first introduce our first speaker, Alexander Gates, who is an associate research scientist in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Northeastern University. He works on science of science to uncover how organizational structures and strategic decisions stimulate innovation, foster creativity, and impact success. And he will talk to us today about the importance of data for developing gender policies in science.
Thank you so much, Dean Johnson, for the really kind introduction. And thank you all for coming today. It's really great to be able to talk with you, even if we can't be sharing the same physical space with each other. As just mentioned, my name is Alex Gates. I'm an associate research scientist in the Department of Sociology at Northeastern University, and I'm also a research affiliate of Northeastern's Network Science Institute. And I'm also really happy to share that this summer I'll be moving to the University of Virginia, where I'm starting as an assistant professor of data science in the new School of Data Science there. My primary research program broadly explores how interconnectedness shapes the social, scientific, and business world around us. Sometimes called computational social science, the science of science, or people analytics, this research explores human behavior and the emergent constraints of the organizations, societies, and ecosystems that we build. Today, I'd like to talk with you about the importance of data for understanding the gendered landscape of science and developing effective policies to promote gender equity in science. Specifically, I'm going to be highlighting 3 concrete projects that were empowered by big data views. Before I begin, I should acknowledge that gender equity is a complicated, multifaceted, and intersectional problem. I approach this as an ally, and I aim to contribute to the conversation by helping to elucidate the roots and impact of gendered data in science. So to help contextualize the scope of this discussion, let's recall the 3 pillars of scientific careers: research, teaching, and leadership. To date, most of the effort has been placed on understanding gender policies and research in the teaching pillars. Indeed, the rest of this talk is really going to focus on exploring research. But I think it's very important to develop tools and techniques that can also quantify the role of scientific leadership and organizational structure in shaping the scientific enterprise. My lab already has a few projects started in this direction, and we're hiring at all levels. So if these topics interest you, please contact me, and I'd love to talk. So why is data important for understanding and developing gendered policies in science? Well, I think it's best captured in the fantastic book, Data Feminism, where they write, counting and measuring do not always have to be tools of oppression. We can use them to hold power accountable, to reclaim overlooked histories, and to build collective and solidarity in science. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that we're not just trying to count and tabulate. All of the data points that we discuss are real people living their lives in the scientific enterprise. And it's really important that we contrast the data with the actual stories that each person is living. So in the science of science, it's really important to think about where our data is coming from. And most of you are likely familiar with the very high-level statistical overviews stemming from survey data, typically aggregated at the organizational or national levels. While profound, this data lacks the ability to understand the interplay of the forces impacting individual scientific careers. On the other hand, researchers have also gathered really detailed individual information from personal surveys, but these typically focus on target populations at specific institutions, in specific disciplines, or in specific countries that don't capture the breadth of the scientific experiences encountered by everyone contributing to science. Instead, another increasingly popular source of data are the bibliometric databases. These are large-scale collections of the products of scientific inquiry, typically publications and patents. And they have the advantage of being a nearly complete representation of the scientific population, although they weren't initially gathered and aggregated for the purposes that we're going to put them through today. And for the sake of completeness, I thought I'd also mention a third source of data, which really should be much more popular than it is right now. And that's the use of randomized controlled trials in the scientific process. So there are a few really excellent examples where they've manipulated grant funding or the positions of posters at conferences. But as you might imagine, scientists don't always like being the subject of an experiment. And so we really don't have enough of these yet to say something concrete about what's happening in the scientific enterprise. But I believe that the future of the science of science is really going to be how can we develop and use some of the techniques applied in really big data companies to be able to understand and manipulate the scientific process itself. So what does this data tell us about scientific careers? Well, there's extensive evidence over the last 50 years of gender differences in academia, suggesting that women are underrepresented in STEM disciplines, that they publish fewer articles throughout a career, they register fewer patents, receive less funding, and their work is less recognition from the scientific community. However, the deep interrelatedness of these factors has kind of limited our ability to differentiate the causes from the consequences of inequality in academia. To truly understand the roots of gender inequality, we need to survey the whole longitudinal, disciplinary, and geographic landscape, which is possible only if we capture complete publishing careers for all scientists across disciplinary and national boundaries. So one example that has helped to really explore deeply these factors is a recent project that we had in collaboration with Professor Laszlo Barbasi and the other members of the Center for Complex Networks Research. And what we did was we reconstructed the full publishing career of 1.5 million scientists from their publication records in the Web of Science. Now, this number is highly limited because we actually required that they ended their careers by 2010. So this does not capture all active scientists at the moment, but nonetheless, it's a very good snapshot of scientists who are conducting science over the last 100 years. We then algorithmically inferred their gender based on first names. And it's important to remember that names provide only a very rough signal on gender, and that binary gender is very much so an oversimplification, since gender is a social construct with many variations. Yet I argue it's kind of sufficient to capture the large-scale statistical patterns that are signatures of gender differences in science. So overall, we found that the system contains 27% women and 73% men, an aggregate number that hides large temporal and disciplinary variations. So for example, in 1945, only 14% of authors were women. Well, in 2005, we found that 35% of authors were women. Likewise, we see that in physics, only 13% of authors are women, while in the life sciences, there are actually almost 40% women authors. Beyond the clear population inequality, though, lies what's called the productivity puzzle. The observation that the average man publishes more throughout the course of a full career than the average woman, and that they receive more total impact for that work. We can confirm that indeed, while an average man publish 13 articles throughout a career, an average woman author will only publish 9.6, creating a 27% gender gap in productivity. Similarly, there's a 33% gender gap in the total number of citations that the average author receives for a lifetime's worth of work. This exists even after controlling for all these tricky temporal variation and inflation in the prevalence of citations, removing self-citations, so on and so forth. But paradoxically, the gender gap in productivity has actually been increasing over the last 50 years. So even though we're getting more women to join the scientific workforce, this has only exacerbated the productivity inequality rather than stemming it. However, our data lets us dive deeper into individual careers. And we realize that on average, men and women were publishing the same number of articles per year, about 1.3. This, of course, suggests that the productivity puzzle has its roots in the length of a career, which we can confirm has a substantial gender gap of 15% on average. In other words, the data suggests that their productive performance of men and women is largely indistinguishable while conducting science, but it's the time frame over which they're working, which largely contributes to the observed gender differences. Another way of approaching this problem is to look at the dropout rate, or the probability that an author just published their last publication. It's important to remember that the end of a publishing career does not always mean the end of a scientific career. Authors stop publishing, may transition to administrative tasks or more prominent teaching roles, or they might be moving into industry where they're not sharing their discoveries through the typical publication mechanisms. However, the temporal variation in the dropout rate does show some very interesting features. Namely, there's a rise during the first 4 to 6 years, the typical length of a PhD, followed by a gradual dip during the middle of a career, and finally another rise towards the end of an academic career at around 40 years. Critically, the dropout rate of women is always higher than that of men throughout the entire career. This immediately indicates that systemic inequality is not an issue just for young women scientists, and that sometimes they say, if you tough it out, you'll eventually be treated equally. Rather, women scientists face roadblocks throughout their entire careers. So what's the impact of these gender differences? Well, it would be great if we could artificially increase the women scientists' career length to match that of men, to see, what are the missing productivity that's missing from science right now. But that's pretty tricky. There's a bunch of details related to inferring and producing publications out of nothing. Instead, it's actually a lot easier to artificially terminate the careers of men scientists to match that of women scientists. So what we did was a massive matching experiment in which we controlled for many other potential confounding variables, including discipline, time, country, collaboration potential, so on and so forth. And we artificially terminated men's careers at a comparable rate to women. We find that the productivity gap in this controlled experiment reduces from 27% to 8%, and the impact gap reduces from 30% to 12%. So while not completely equal, we're still missing a few very important details about what's different between men and women's science careers. This does show a substantial improvement. Furthermore, if we match our scientists based on their productivity, we find that the impact gap is actually completely eliminated, suggesting that gender inequality in science is largely driven by the systemic promotion or inhibition of careers, and not so much a factor about recognition. These results suggest that if we want to design gender equity policies, it's not enough to only support early career scientists. We need to have a sustained effort to support women scientists throughout their entire careers. Next, I'd like to introduce a wonderful study illustrating how everyday decisions we make as authors can actually impact the gendered recognition in science. Specifically, Jordan, working in the lab of Professor Danny Bassett at the University of Pennsylvania, focused on the gender composition of the reference list for nearly 300,000 publications in neuroscience. They asked, does gender of a publication's authors impact the distribution of genders in the literature that they cite? To answer this question, the team inferred the gender of the first and last authors on each publication and all of those publication references, categorizing them into one of four bins: men, men, woman, woman, man, woman, or woman, man. So for example, their own publication would be classified in the man, woman bin. To quantify if a certain author gender combination is over or underrepresented in the reference list, they excluded self-citations, since authors tend to promote their own work, and then built a model of reference likelihood that integrates journal prestige, publication team size, document type, and several other features known in the literature to impact references. They found that men publications appeared 5% more than expected by chance, while women publications were referenced 14% less than expected by their model. Combining this with the gender of the citing publication's authors reveals that men teams, comprising about 60% of the neuroscience literature, primarily drive this reference inequality. On the other hand, women teams tended to contain many more men-woman and women-woman references than would be expected by chance. So there's some homophily in the references that we are picking, in the sense that we are selecting individuals who are more similar to us as authors. This suggests one policy that you can adopt right now without waiting for interventions from leadership, administration, or other government officials to support you. And that's called the Citation Diversity Statement. Citation Diversity Statement is a short, factual paragraph appended to the end of a publication, much like an acknowledgement or a data availability statement. And it typically consists of four parts. One, a statement of the importance of citation diversity, why we should be caring about this. Two, a reference to the method used to ascertain citation diversity within your publication. Three, the factual breakdown of citations in your own paper. So for example, we would actually look to see how many of the references in your reference list are contained within each of the four bins based on the gender of the authors of those references. And four, a commitment to improving equitability practices in science. So these gender citation diversity statements encourage you to reflect on your own citation practices and recognize if bias has creeped into the body of your work that you're acknowledging. And I think that it's a really important, concrete way that we as authors can begin to change our own behaviors and organically produce equitable practices within the scientific ecosystem. Finally, I'd like to reflect on an important fundamental question for gender policy, which is why? Why do we care? Why does it all matter? And of course, the first fundamental answer is social morality. But beyond that, equity reflects who has a voice in science. Well, we're all interested in the search for truth. Scientists whose voices are promoted get to define which questions are the most important. Yet we know that different populations study different topics relative to their own interests, the context in which they're living, and their own culture. All of these things come into play in defining what we know about the world and how we're framing scientific questions. We can actually measure this directly. And indeed, in a wonderful study by Cassidy Sugimoto's group at Georgia Tech, they explored the interplay between gender and race in the scientific population working on very specific topics. They found that homophily plays a very strong role in topic selection. In other words, people are much more likely to research topics that resonate with their own lived experiences. So for example, they found that women of color were much more likely to study gender-based violence, topics related to pregnancy, and community interventions for health as opposed to specific diseases. So in conclusion, to have a rigorous and effective scientific system, we need a diverse scientific workforce that can integrate and assess the importance of many different types of questions. This morning, I briefly offered 3 examples of how data-driven analysis can inform and enhance the development of policy to promote gender equity in science. So I thank you very much for your time today, and I welcome any questions that you might have or encourage you to get in contact with me if this research sounds interesting. We are hiring. Thank you very much.